Over the next 2 to 3 months, the most likely scenario that we're going to see when it comes to the ENSO outlook is that we're going to be in a neutral ENSO phase, which will play a big role in terms of the conditions you should experience in the United States for the next few spring months. This is a typical pattern the United States experiences during an ENSO neutral pattern. We typically see a pronounced jet stream dip throughout the northern portion of the United States, bringing cooler than average conditions, and we also see a subtropical jet move slightly further northward. It's very similar to what we see during a La Nina phase, but we do see a little bit more moisture focused in towards the southeast rather than, let's say, the Ohio River Valley. So in the southeast, during an ENSO neutral pattern, you should expect more moist than average conditions. And then for much of the southwestern portion of the United States, it's slightly warmer than average during an ENSO neutral pattern, which would certainly be quite a transition if we were to see this occur, because of course for much of the southwest it's been a lot cooler and a lot more moist than average. So if we were to see warmer than average conditions as for this spring, that will definitely be quite a change when it comes to the weather conditions. We have to wait and see if this will actually occur, because we've been seeing height anomalies that are well below average for much of the West Coast for much of the winter. So it's going to be difficult for the pattern to change that quickly, even though we're in an ENSO neutral pattern at this time. So there could still be that possibility. It could be more moist than average for much of the West Coast, thanks to the fact that the air pressure on average has been a lot lower than average, which of course is creating more of a convective environment right around the West Coast for more moist than average conditions to occur, and as well as cooler than average conditions. So we're going to need to wait and see which pattern will take hold for the spring months, but it could very well I will say most likely it'll be hovering around average when it comes to winter weather conditions, spring conditions for much of the West Coast. Another important factor we need to take a look at when forecasting what type of spring conditions you should expect in the United States is how likely tornadoes and hailstorms are during each ENSO pattern. So we see that during a El Nino pattern, the tornado and hail frequency index is a lot lower, where we do see that a large area of the United States experiences less tornadoes and less hailstorms than average. While if we were to take a look at what typically happens during a La Nina, we see much more hailstorms and tornadoes on average. So we're going to be in a neutral phase, so it should fall right in between what we typically see during El Nino or La Nina. But since a neutral phase leans more to La Nina type conditions where we see a more pronounced jet stream dip, I'll say that it is a little bit more likely that hailstorms and tornadoes will occur in certain areas of the United States, since that's simply since a neutral pattern is very similar to a La Nina pattern in that it brings cooler air further southward for that instability and that convective available potential energy to develop. So I do expect a higher likelihood of tornadoes and hailstorms this spring. So these are the precipitation anomalies compared to the long-term average between the years 1991 to 2020 for neutral springs, and we do see that the precipitation varies depending throughout the United States for the most part, and there isn't really a single area outside of maybe the south central United States where we see precipitation anomalies that are very far from average, where we do see that mostly the precipitation anomalies are very minuscule, but the south central United States during a neutral phase does simply experience drier than average conditions. So that is a possibility, but since the Gulf of Mexico is warmer than average, we could see that cancel. We could see it, the warmer temperatures cancel the drier conditions out, where we see a little bit more moisture in the southeast. So I don't expect, so there isn't really a very good indicator that shows that it's much more moist or much drier than average during neutral springs, which is definitely something to keep in mind when taking a look at these climate division plots when it comes to precipitation anomaly. When it comes to temperature anomalies, however, it is a different story, where typically during a neutral spring, we see that much of the West Coast experiences much warmer than average conditions, especially California, Arizona, as well as Nevada, while the eastern half of the United States experiences cooler than average conditions, with the cooler than average conditions focusing in more right up along the northeast coast. So this is definitely something to keep in mind, and that certainly raises the likelihood that much of the eastern half of the United States will experience cooler than average conditions, and it's going to be compounded by the fact that a negative North Atlantic oscillation is expected to dominate most of the spring. So that's definitely something to pay close attention to along the eastern half of the United States. And we need to see if temperatures will actually be warmer than average along the West Coast, because like I said, even though that's typically what happens during a neutral phase, that's definitely just because it's a neutral phase does not automatically determine that it's going to be warmer than average. The certainty is certainly higher during a neutral phase for the western half that it's going to be warmer than average. But since this winter been so moist and cooler than average, it might be a little bit too difficult even for a neutral phase to cancel out those conditions or bring those warmer than average conditions to the southwest if the air pressure remains low right around the western half of the United States like it has been all winter long. So we're gonna need to just wait and see. So I'm leaning a little bit more towards average weather conditions when it comes to temperature and precipitation for much of the western half of the United States. Here's a drought monitor for the lower 48, and we do see that over the past several long-term forecast videos that I made, which I haven't made in quite a while. I think the last one I made was back in November, so it's been a while since I made these, but the last time I made this, probably around November, the West Coast was under a severe drought. Now, of course, that drought has definitely subsided for the most part, thanks to the multiple atmospheric rivers we've seen move through the western half of the United States, which has subsided the drought conditions quite a bit. So this won't necessarily make a major effect when it comes to the type of conditions you should expect, because now it's a lot we're seeing conditions that are a lot more moist than average for much of the western half of the United States. So we won't really see a powerful ridge, and it's less likely we're going to see drier than average conditions as a result of a weaker drought that's going on along the western half of the United States. But it's important to keep in mind that the Midwest is still, at least portions of the Midwest are still under a severe drought, especially the more western portion of the Midwest. So that definitely raises the certainty for me that we're less likely to experience major rain events along the western half of the Midwest, because typically during a drought, there's a very dominant ridge that's most likely going to block a lot of low pressure systems from being able to penetrate the Midwest, and that will of course reduce the possibility of severe weather as well. And of course, during drought conditions, it's simply also warmer, not only because of course there's less clouds in the sky during a drought, which allows the short wave radiation to hit the surface and get absorbed more by the surface rather than get reflected back into space by the clouds, but also during a drought, the soil heats up a lot quicker since there isn't any water to absorb that latent heat. So we're more likely going to see warmer than average conditions in these drought-stricken areas along the western half of the United States. I mean the western half of the Midwest. And taking a look at the East Coast, we see that the drought is pretty much non-existent. So that makes me believe that if we're going to see a big ridge located in the central United States for this spring, that'll steer more of the low pressure systems towards the eastern half of the United States, for a more likely possibility that we're going to see a little bit more moisture for much of the eastern coast states. So it's definitely something to be aware of. That's not a guarantee, but that's certainly a possibility when we see a drought somewhere in the United States, that typically somewhere else has to experience some more moist than average conditions for the atmosphere to sort of balance itself out. Taking a look at the CFS model's forecast when it comes to precipitation anomalies over the next 3 months, which are considered the spring months, we do see that the CFS model is forecasting that much of the Ohio River Valley will experience more moist than average conditions, which isn't a surprise since during a neutral phase, we typically do see a jet stream that dips further southward, and that'll of course steer a lot of low pressure systems towards the eastern half of the United States. But what's interesting is that the CFS model wants to bring drier than average conditions to much of the more Gulf Coast states, especially if you're further southward into Florida, along the immediate Gulf Coast as well. So I'd take this with a grain of salt, considering the fact that this contradicts what typically happens during a neutral pattern. And also the Gulf of Mexico is experiencing sea surface temperatures warmer than average, so we're bound to see a lot more humidity and convective available potential energy to fuel a lot of showers and thunderstorms throughout the southeast. So I take it with a grain of salt. I still think that it's going to be more moist than average for the southeast, especially since there's a possibility a pretty big ridge could steer storms towards the southeast, since there needs to be an equal amount of convergence along the surface along with divergence, which would occur right around the drought-stricken region. So that certainly does raise certainty that we're more likely to experience more moist than average conditions for the southeast. But take a look at what the CFS model forecasts when it comes to the western half of the United States. It's mostly average. There isn't really an area where it's much more moist than average or much drier than average. So for the most part, precipitation is average when it comes to the CFS model's forecast. Taking a look at the CFS model's temperature anomaly forecast, we do see that the CFS model expects much of the United States to experience warmer than average conditions outside of maybe the southwestern portion, the south central portion of California. However, again, I'll take the CFS model's forecast with a grain of salt, because it's always been heavily biased towards bringing warmer than average conditions to much of the United States. I wouldn't rule out that possibility that could happen for the eastern half of the United States, considering the fact that it's already been a very warm winter and there's been a very persistent ridge parked right over the eastern half of the United States for pretty much the entirety of the winter. So there is that possibility the southerly winds will be strong enough still as throughout the spring for warmer than average conditions to occur. But definitely keep in mind that the CFS model is very biased towards warmer than average conditions. I do expect that with a neutral phase and a negative North Atlantic oscillation, the temperatures will fall back down to cooler than average as we approach the spring for the eastern portion of the United States. Another key thing I want to show you guys is the sea surface temperature anomaly. At this time, we do see that the Gulf of Mexico is experiencing temperatures warmer than average, and not only does that enhance the possibility of more showers to develop right up along the southeast, but that enhances the possibility of severe weather and tornadoes, thanks to the fact that convective available potential energy will be a lot higher with sea surface temperatures a lot warmer, because of course that warms up the air mass located in the southeast, and that allows the air mass to hold a lot more moisture to fuel a lot of these thunderstorms and of course tornadoes, since the convective available potential energy is a lot higher when the sea surface temperatures are a lot warmer. So that's something to keep in mind throughout the southeast and especially the immediate Gulf Coast. And for the areas further northward, we do see that the Carolinas are experiencing sea surface temperatures slightly cooler than average, but I expect the sea surface temperatures to rise closer to average over the next several months. And for the northeast, we do see temperatures are warmer than average. We'll have to see if this has a major effect, but with a negative North Atlantic oscillation, we could see those temperatures potentially fall back down to normal after a very warm winter that we've just experienced throughout the northeast. So that's something to be aware of as well. So here's the North Atlantic oscillation forecast over the next several months, which is another big pattern when determining what type of conditions you should expect over the next several months. And we do see that for most of spring, it's most likely that the North Atlantic oscillation will hover slightly below average to closer to average, but more so slightly below average. So I expect slightly more jet stream dips than what you've been accustomed to all winter long, where we've seen that throughout the heart of the winter, we've been mostly in a positive North Atlantic oscillation, which has been bringing stronger southerly winds and warmer than average temperatures throughout much of the eastern half of the United States. But expect those fortunes to change as we approach the spring, more into the later spring months, where the negative North Atlantic oscillation should be the dominant weather pattern, which will induce more jet stream dips and cooler than average conditions and potentially more moist than average conditions for the eastern United States. So here's my official spring forecast. So in the Northeast and the Northern Great Lakes, I expect conditions to be cooler and more moist than averages as a result of a neutral phase that's expected to dominate all throughout the spring months, which will bring more significant jet stream dips, as well as the fact that a negative North Atlantic oscillation is expected to dominate. So I do expect more low pressure systems to move along those jet stream dips, as well as cooler than average conditions, of course, behind those jet stream dips. So expect cooler and more moist than average conditions for the Northeast. And then taking a look at the Southeast, I'm expecting conditions to be more moist than average, thanks to the fact that the sea surf temperatures along the Gulf of Mexico should be warmer than average, which should raise the temperature and, of course, raise the amount of water vapor the atmosphere could hold, as well as the convective available potential energy, as well as the fact that during a neutral phase, we see a strong subtropical jet move through the southeast, which does typically bring more moist than average conditions and of course, enhances a chance of tornadoes thanks to that higher level of convective available potential energy. And take a look at the Midwest, I'm expecting it to be warmer and drier than average thanks to the drought that's going on. It's very difficult for a drought to go away overnight, so I expect those conditions to continue. And take a look at the western half of the United States, I'm expecting average conditions, but it could easily go either way, because on one side, it's been a lot more moist and cool than average for much of the western half of the United States, so that could easily continue into the spring months. However, on the other side, there's also a neutral phase, which does typically bring warmer than average conditions to the western half of the United States. So it could go either way, but I'm leaning more towards average conditions, since I do believe the neutral phase and this weather pattern where we're seeing height anomalies a lot lower than average sort of balance each other out to where the average conditions should take hold for the western half of the United States when it comes to temperature as well as precipitation. So this is my spring forecast. If you want even more in-depth forecasts regarding the type of conditions you should expect this spring, just make sure to comment down below your location or general area, and I'll make sure to give you guys a more in-depth outlook when it comes to your spring forecast and your location. So make sure to comment down below if you're interested. But thank you guys for watching.